There's in journalism studies, there are a lot of people have spilled a lot of kind of ink on paper, arguing about what some would call peace journalism.
I'm seeing this bulletproof jacket. So have you been in any such place where you need to use this?
I mean, this is one of the things I think newsrooms have struggled to do, is say, look, we can no longer be the first.
Hi everyone, welcome back to another episode. Today we have with us Dr. Richard Stupart. He is an expert in understanding ethics in journalism and mass media. He is a professor at the University of Liverpool. So first of all, thank you so much for giving us your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, your expertise is mostly in violence and wartime. What does it mean to witness violence ethically? Because you've had background in philosophy as well. So
as you said, I deal a lot. I think a lot about journalism. I think a lot about journalists who work in situations of war and conflict. So a particular kind of journalism. And for me, witnessing is very important, I suppose, like way of organizing my thoughts. And the reason for this is that compared to other kinds of journalism, where, for example, I don't know, I'm being flip, but if I go to a garden show or if I go to a music concert and I learn something about a music concert, it would be weird to say, you know, you're a bad person if you don't go and tell other people what you learned about the garden show or the music concert. But for journalism, who's kind of the object of interest, the thing the journalist is interested in is something like extreme injustice or suffering or these sorts of things that you see in war and conflict journalism. It would be to go and learn about these things, to hear stories of sufferers, to kind of put yourself in a situation as a journalist where you're learning about these things, to then say, you know, fail to report. We seem much more comfortable saying, you had all this knowledge and you didn't speak out, and that's a bit icky and immoral. Why were you there? Maybe you were kind of voyeuristic. This is inappropriate. So for me, the sort of witnessing language is a way of capturing this idea that for these kinds of journalism, where journalists go out and they seek privileged knowledge of other people's suffering or wrongdoing or injustice, there's almost, you find yourself in this position of a witness. So someone who, because I am one of very few people who know, say, what's happening in Sudan, or what's happening in some village in the Eastern DRC or Ukraine. If I'm one of very few people with very specialist knowledge and access, for example, to like a publication that I could write in, you find yourself in a very unique and difficult moral position, because if you are able to speak out about what you've seen, we think perhaps some good things might come of that, or you sort of are doing the work of justice. But if I fail to speak out, if victims tell me their stories of how they've suffered, if I kind of watch or film tragedy, and then I put that SD card down and I put it away, I'm equally, on the other hand, liable for these accusations that, you know, you are not profiting, you're ignoring other people's pain. You are choosing to remain silent when people are suffering in these sort of conflict or war zones. And had I spoken up, things might have been different. And so it's witness, the kind of position of journalists as a witness is a very interesting thing, because it's a particular kind of like professional work where just because you were there and because you know some things that other people don't know, you suddenly find yourself on your shoulders is a moral obligation that you may not have asked for, but you are now stuck with.
yeah, I mean, like a lot of times, I mean, you'll be the best person to tell me if these situations do occur a lot of times. But a lot of times, this thought occurs to me that there could be some situation where hiding information of people's suffering could lead to a more peaceful venture to an event. So how would you then ethically know that, if as a journalist having access to the resource, by knowing that these many people are being suffered, but you cannot put that into public, because then that could lead to a more violent situation.
Polarization, yeah. So this is a really hard problem. I think on one level, this is a sort of hard question of the kind of thing a moral philosopher might dwell on. So if I have privileged knowledge, and if I speak out about the injustice, for example, that I know about, how sure am I of what the consequences would be? How sure am I that if I speak out, sort of good things might follow? or how versus, should I be worried that when I speak out I might polarize issues, for example, further? I might cause further kind of violence, division. So I think that's a hard question. I think part of the answer, I couldn't answer it in general, but I think part of the answer really does depend on how much you can reasonably know or foresee about the consequences of speaking out. And if you have some sense of what the political or social consequences of speaking out about some sort of act of violence might be, that then maybe should guide your actions. I'm speaking in vagaries here. There are very good concrete examples of this. So there is a really good a PhD thesis by a woman called Cecilia Arigui. So she was interested in Kenya after the elections. There was this period of extraordinary violence between sort of two factions. And journalists in Kenya, newsrooms, had real debates about, look, do we report that this faction attacked that faction? Because if you report this in the national newspaper in a period where everyone is really tense, that could just inspire the other faction to go and take revenge. And so journalists were like, look, we're caught up in the politics of this thing, and we need to make these hard decisions. But also, if we don't report that this faction is harming this other faction, people are not aware that violence is happening, that people are in danger, that the situation is tense. In journalism studies, there are people have spilled a lot of kind of ink on paper arguing about what some would call peace journalism. So it's this idea that we shouldn't think of journalists as just abstract observers to what's going on. Journalism is politically implicated. What you choose to write about, how you choose to write about it. If you choose not to write about things, all of these will produce political, social consequences. And journalists can't avoid, as much as they would like to say, oh, I'm just a fly-on-the-wall observer, you are politically caught up in things. And so peace journalists would say, you should take that seriously, and you should angle your coverage towards what will produce more like peaceful or kind of non-violent outcomes. They then are, and again, not without cause, attacked by other groups that say, well, the moment a journalist sort of takes off this, even if it is a fiction, stops adhering to this fiction of objectivity and says, I am politically positioned, I will write with the politics in mind, suddenly journalists become part of a conflict. You risk becoming a target. So if I know the journalist arrives at that protest and I know his alignment is to report in favor of the other party, I'm no longer going to treat them like an impartial observer. And we see dangers of this. We see in the Netherlands, for example, during COVID, anti-COVID, sort of COVID denialists saw journalism from their point of view as being politically aligned as with the pro-vaccine lobby. Now, I am not endorsing, COVID denialism, but politically, these groups saw journalists as working for the government, as working for the sort of healthcare establishment, and they would target them at protests. So if a journalist arrived at an anti-vax protest, they would get stones to be thrown at them, they'd be threatened with violence, and it reached the point that the national broadcaster in the Netherlands eventually took all the branding off their white vans because they didn't want to be known as coming from that outlet, because the moment people saw that, they would sort of attack them. So this is, the last I'll say on this, it's a really complicated question, and quite a lot hangs on it. And it cuts to this sort of thing of, where do you stand? Or do you see journalism as a neutral, objective, detached kind of profession? Or do you see journalism as having political effects and responsible for the political effects that it has?
Is there a point where showing violence becomes more exploitative rather than informative?
I think that's absolutely a danger. In fact, very recently, so I think this was maybe at the beginning of last year, particularly in the world of humanitarian photojournalism, so people who take photographs for humanitarian agencies, there was an issue like this that really caused a lot of headaches for Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, where in a clinic in the Congo, a photojournalist came and started posing children from one of the medical clinics outside, and showing their faces, was taking images of, the sort of the wounds on their bodies, these sorts of things. And this produced a huge kind of outcry. One was this question of, how are you treating subjects' dignity here, right? So you go to this place, ostensibly the reason you're here is to take images that will help these people, and yet the images you take harm these people's dignity. You don't treat them so much like you certainly don't treat them like you would treat a child back home in France or America, right? Yeah. So there was this sort of criticism. It was also a criticism that just because of the economics of the photographic industry at the moment, those images, the photographer had rights to them as well as the agency that brought it in. And some of the images from trips like this end up on places, stock websites, so stock image, so Alamy, Getty, these sorts of places. And again, there's these debates about what is it that we're doing when we go to the middle of places where people are suffering. We take these images of them. We turn those into commodities where someone can, I mean, please God, no one does, but you can buy it and print it as a wallpaper, right?
Right.
And so this sort of kicked off this thing. There's this whole sort of economy that kind of it predates, I suppose, of images of suffering, particularly children, and often in very unwholesome ways. So there's an investigator called Benjamin Chesterton who really got interested in this case of where these images from particularly Doctors Without Borders clinics were ending up. He pointed out, a lot of them were stock sites, but even worse than that is that from stock sites, some of these images of children were ending up on like dark web websites for child pornographers. And so it was kind of, this is an extreme case, but it highlights this idea that it's not enough to go and like take an image of someone who's suffering, right? It matters.
Right.
Firstly, it matters upstream. What do we do with that image? Should it be available to be bought or sold by anyone? Should we treat these images with a certain kind of respect? What does that mean to treat an image with respect? So we have these intuitions often, and it's a hard question to sort of resolve. But when you have cases like this with MSF, they come up as there are very real consequences to your organization if audiences see you treating the people that you're meant to help. There's also, so that's a sort of more the economics and distribution question, but it is also things around if ultimately the motivation, as I said, is to go and help these people, and journalism or photojournalism is a route to helping them. Surely that would involve respecting their dignity, kind of consent, these sorts, and not going there in a way that just profits me and you, who I photographed, who took time out of your day to tell me often horrible stories, actually fundamentally sees no benefit from our exchange. That just feels in some degree like the only person in the humanitarian setup who is really freely donating their time and effort is you, the person talking to the cameraman. Because as the cameraman, I get paid. As the organization that brought me there, they get paid. Getty gets paid when the stock image. So literally everyone else gets something out of this exchange, and the only person who's really giving anything for free, ironically, is the sufferer sitting at the end of the camera.
Yeah, interesting. But then, talking about things in wars and controlling, not controlling, but then understanding or having the power to say that this will go to public and this will not go to public, then in such cases, who controls the knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, media control is a huge thing. So increasingly, at least since, in my experience, the Iraq wars, even as far back as maybe the 1990s, armies started to realize this thing that you could win the war on the ground. You could occupy territory, but you don't win the story of the war, right? So you win the war on the ground, but the story is that you're the big baddie who should be resisted. And then you're never actually going to properly occupy a country. So occupying a country is not just about physically controlling the terrain or having the ability to kill people. It's about having your presence accepted. And this is, the US was quite early. I mean, very badly did they think about this at the time, but to clock on this idea that it's important to kind of win the story of the war as much as it's important to win the war itself. They're really interesting thinkers in media and communications who talk about this kind of phenomenon. So there's a sort of esoteric French writer called Baudrillard, who, as far back again as the Iraq War, so he wrote this, the first Gulf War, I believe. He wrote a series of essays titled "The Gulf War Will Not Happen," "The Gulf War Is Not Happening," and famously, "The Gulf War Did Not Happen." And what he means by that, so he's being like needlessly provocative, but the thing he's trying to get at is, if you were an American average Joe citizen, what the Iraq War was for you, how you imagine it, the stories that arrive of like what Iraq is like, what the insurgency is like, all the rest of it, is absolutely night and day different from the experience of a Marine who is actually fighting the war. And so Baudrillard would say something like the Gulf War was really actually just a one-sided American slaughter because their weapons were just overwhelming. But back home in America, they were told a story about this is a war that we're fighting, and it's difficult, and it's two sides equally matched, so on. And he was getting to this idea that for a lot of international conflicts, what the civilians on each side think the conflict is, if they have no direct experience of it themselves, depends hugely on media, right? So what you or I think Ukraine is actually like, I'm assuming you've not been, I've certainly not been, we're depending on media, social media, news media, but ultimately our view, what we think reality is as it concerns these wars, is purely coming to us through media. Now, back in the 90s, this was far more hegemonic, so you would have, if the Gulf War happened, there were a tiny handful of news stations that had people there, and so everyone would watch the same kind of source. Now, with the advent of social media, phones, like something like Gaza is a good example, where there are just an ocean of kind of people trying to tell us directly from Gaza what's happening, people trying to fake being those people for like to raise GoFundMes and be grifters. You have sort of disinformation operations from, I mean, Israel particularly, but a bunch of other interested countries. And so suddenly this environment where, what should I think the reality in Gaza is like becomes horribly, like, polluted would maybe be one word, but just very noisy with so many different testimonies, many of which are wildly incompatible. And so we start to end up, the danger is we end up in the situation where, depending who I follow on social media and who you follow on social media, we could have completely different views of what we think reality is like. And it matters because depending on what I think reality is like in Gaza, that may impact how I vote, whether I send money. In the long term, sort of my opinion of Israel, my opinion of Palestine, of the US. So the political consequences or stakes of this can be quite high. But it's very hard to fix this problem of like, well, who should I trust when there's 1,000 voices telling me, oh, this is the reality of a thing? So to get back to answering your question, I think, for right or wrong, better or worse, we've moved from a media environment where once upon a time fewer sort of companies, news corporations could control perceptions of reality, particularly around war and conflict, for a more, let's call it, democratic environment, but at the expense of actually it becomes harder and harder to know who to trust on what kinds of issues. And again, it's a difficult problem.
Right, I agree. And then in these cases, I mean, I think that when we have too much of polluted information and when even a non-trained person can become a source of media using social media, just a phone recording stuff and uploading, I think then the conventional media would then take a more of a leadership position and then maybe churn down the reality much better because they have access to a lot of doors which not these people with just phone would have.
Yeah. And so social media has created a lot of anxieties, as you could imagine, for big newsrooms. And this was absolutely, I mean, this is one of the things I think newsrooms have struggled to do, is say, look, we can no longer be the first to get material from Gaza because Joe with a cell phone will be there first. We can try and be authoritative or try and like lead, gain a reputation for this being sort of leader. The problem with this is it's not clear that they're doing a good job of being the leading voices always on certain issues. So if you ask the average person where are you getting your news from Gaza, and which news sources do you trust, many people would get the vast majority of their news from social media, not from like the BBC. And many would place as much trust in particular kind of posters or accounts or sort of, depending how much you want to embrace them, independent news producers, rather than kind of formal news organizations. The other problem, though, for big news organizations is that having foreign correspondents kind of based overseas to do like permanent work, if you're a news organization, you will be taking seriously. So they would need to be there with insurance, security details, accommodation, a bunch of like very expensive things will be put in place so that you can have a high quality satellite uplink CNN broadcast from somewhere. And early 2000s, that could be as much as like $1 million a year that you're paying just to keep your correspondent in Iraq, for example. So when you're doing media, I need to, if I'm a big media house, I'm laying out $1 million a year on top of your salary to keep you in Iraq so you can report. I need to earn enough back off that reporting that I can keep doing it. But then competing with me is 10,000 people who have increasingly high quality, high definition cell phones, who are out there making content of various degrees of professionalism, who are not paying $1 million per person to keep them safe. And so the economics of this don't favor, in many respects, the big news organizations. But it also carries, I suppose, like risk and ethics problems, because now you or I are depending on often people to tell us stories of what's happening from Gaza or Ukraine, who are not always like accredited, insured, people from news organizations who's, they are sort of freelancers who find themselves in these places who are trying to sort of lean on social media to find an audience. But if they die or they get kidnapped, they don't belong to a news organization. No one is going to talk to a president to try and get them released. No one's going to pay a ransom. So it creates this, social media can potentially create this class of media workers, sort of freelance social media journalists, who can do things faster, certainly cheaper, but often less safe. And it's this bargain of, I want to say, are we comfortable with that's how our news is produced? But also, if I decide not to watch that news because I have an ethical compunction, other people will. So it's a systemic problem.
Right. And also, I feel that would, I mean, these are then a good reason when it is not economically viable. You have a lot of uh, competition, and then that would create a lot of pollution. Then, but I think the news media would do have the access to the access to one of the well-read personalities who can actually go and dig through data and see if the narrative stands on the data, and then bring them up and talk about things. But I think that's where I think journalism or big media room are lacking somewhere. What do you feel?
Yeah. I mean, so I think certainly in the world of live reporting, so just saying, oh, there was a bomb blast, this is what it looks like, that there's no, it'd be hard to outcompete social media. But things like you say, like analysis, right? Saying let's crunch through the data, let's go and take enormous data sets, do investigative reporting.
Right.
It takes time, it's difficult, it's not very sexy and photogenic. And requires often very specific skills, computer skills, data skills, investigation skills. In an example of an investigation like the Panama Papers, you need forensic accounting skills. And so big news organizations are still, for the main part, like the places where those sorts of skills, I think, reside. And so for all my cynicism, I do think there is a place for large news organizations. And many large news organizations still have call it like an aura of credibility. So the BBC would be kind of a titan among these, that as much as I might trust Joe 365 from Gaza when he has his camera out, I definitely trust the BBC, for me personally, more, because they are an organization that works based on decades of history of like a certain kind of reporting. And so even there, for all the availability of social media, when I find myself kind of wading through the pollution and trying to work out what's true and what's not, it's not a coincidence that I might eventually go back and say, okay, time out. What is the BBC saying on this, right? So actually just when I can't tell who to trust, I choose to place my trust often in kind of legacy news organizations. Now, not everyone trusts the BBC. Some people, for example, will trust Fox News as their legacy news organization. And there's the whole sidebar there about politics and control. But it is interesting that despite the competition from social media, the sort of reputations of sort of old school news organizations are still something that people tend to respect, or kind of will listen to when they're confused about other accounts.
Interesting. And I'm seeing this this bulletproof jacket. So have you been in any such place where you need to use this?
So my fieldwork when I was a PhD student was going to South Sudan to ostensibly just talk to lots and lots of journalists there. Partly to understand, like, why would you do this job? It's very dangerous. It's very poorly paid. Why would you, like, if you're a rational human being, like, the career prospects are not great. What brings you to do this? But also kind of what were the challenges of working in journalism in that environment? And now South Sudan, as some of your listeners will know, is a active, call it a war zone, conflict area, sort of low-key civil conflict for many years now. And so part of going, I got the flak jacket to go, as it was a requirement from my university at the time. If you're going to go, there is a non-zero chance that there might be a kind of breakdown in order while you're there, and if that happens, you should have the vest. Weirdly, I never wore the vest, which was a kind of an interesting thing, because it's not the sort of object that you would arrive and you just wear and you walk because you look like an idiot. And so it's actually a complicated question about how would I know when it's dangerous enough to wear a flak jacket? Because if it's very dangerous and I haven't put my flak jacket on already, then it's too late. But if it's perfectly safe and I put my flak jacket on, I look like an idiot. And so there's actually, like, it's fascinating to me that it's not just a protective piece of gear. You need to almost know what is the appropriate etiquette for wearing this thing.
Yeah, it's a fashion statement then.
Yeah, and it changes how people respond to you. I use it often bring it out at the end of a class I teach on journalism, media, and war. And it's very interesting how students react to it. Like, some students are like, wow, that's such a cool object. Can I try it on and take that Instagram videos is popular? Others won't touch it. Others will be like, this is kind of, it freaks them out a little bit. And I think because culturally, symbolically, it carries a bunch of weight, and you can see definitely people like respond to that.
Interesting. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And like, do you have any question or anything at the end?
I mean, I'm curious, as someone who works in media, what do you see as the future? I mean, are you optimistic about the future of journalism of this kind?
I mean, I would. It's. I haven't thought about it, but yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I come from a place where I see. I can now say that there's a bit of polarization, which is navigated into journalism, and like once we see polarization in journalism, it's pretty hard to then give that same trust again to journalism back unless we see some sort of revolutionizing event, because in the age of information, 30-40 years back, if a newspaper company would prefer one side of the story, then you would lose trust on the newspaper, and it's very rare that you would again gain trust back. And similarly in
Easily
this,
lost, yeah.
yeah, and similarly now when I turn on television, it's hard for me to go to any news channel and see, because I've lost pretty much of the trust for a certain section of news channels. But I want to be hopeful though at the end of the day, because I don't want to be hopeless
What is the alternative?
and see everything, because I cannot be everywhere and every time. So I would have to lay my trust on something, and yeah, hopefully there will be some revolution.
That'd be great. Yeah, I like that view. I think we have to hang on to hope, because if not, what else is there? I mean, turning around and saying we're lost doesn't seem like a very productive or healthy. You
Right.
can't build a society that way.
Right, and I mean, I also see that tracking history from a very broad perspective, it's like there has been a humongous amount of time in the history where there's been unrest, but we see slots of peace in every part of the history, and I think if we are in the zone of unrest, then there will be a part of peace where maybe journalism can turn back and get themselves up and be more neutral.
Maybe we learn,
Yeah.
as we lose faith in journalism, sort of our infrastructure for knowing what the world is like
Yeah.
falls apart. Maybe we come to remember why we valued it, why this was important,
Right.
in return. That would be nice.
Yeah, and I also trust economists to maybe help media houses to make more money by being neutral.
Find a business model. Yeah,
Yeah.
100%. Thank you.
Thank you so much for giving time. It's been lovely.